This is the Tombigbee Tales, and I'm your host, Shannon Evans. I write about a small town in northeast Mississippi in Columbus. Sometimes I write about the rest of the state. Today, I'm doing the third part in my candidate questions, and I am interviewing Bill Strauss, who's also a mayoral candidate. However, um, Mr. Strauss reneged or said he didn't want to be part. So we're going to ask him the questions that we would have asked if he'd been here. If elected, Mr. Strauss, what are your goals and how would you fund them? And could you please prioritize? On your first day in office, what do you plan to do? And who do you plan to meet? Do you plan to have weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly meetings with all your department heads? Do you plan to do write-outs with certain departments on each ward to see the area for yourself? Do you plan to make any staff changes to your staff in the first few days in office? Since we have a weak mayor, strong council system, how do you propose to get the council to even consider your plans? Before discussing your plans with the council, will you take the advice of the CFO concerning costs? If there are not enough funds to adequately support your plans, what measures would you take to see your plans come to fruition? On economic development questions, these were prepared by members of the public. What strategies will you use to attract new businesses to Columbus, and what incentives will you offer? How will you support local entrepreneurship and small businesses? What industries do you think Columbus should focus on for economic growth? Columbus has the opportunity to be the next music and entertainment capital of the South, especially with a lot of entertainment corporations choosing to leave California. How do you plan to take advantage of this? On youth retention and development, how will you make Columbus more appealing to younger residents and retain talent? What ordinances can be changed to improve quality of life for young people, particularly in the 18 to 35 age brackets? How will you support local education and job training programs? When it comes to public safety, what is your plan to reduce gun violence in Columbus? How will you work with law enforcement and community organizations to address this issue? On the topic of social issues, what strategies will you implement to address homelessness in Columbus? And how will you work with local organizations to provide support services for the indigent? As far as drug policies, do you support decriminalizing marijuana to focus on more pressing issues like fentanyl? Under governance, how will you ensure transparency and accountability within our city government? That goes beyond the city council and beyond the mayor's office. What steps will you take to engage with residents and incorporate their feedback? How will you prioritize infrastructure development and maintenance? What initiatives will you implement to promote environmental sustainability? How will you support local arts and cultural programs? What is your vision for Columbus's future, and how will you achieve it? How do you plan to communicate with the citizens? Will you be doing press conferences, social media, TV, radio, community meetings by wards? Do you plan to do ride-outs with different department heads to see the areas for yourself? How do you plan to communicate with the council in lieu of the open meetings rule? This election, just as the 2021 election, is incredibly divided. How do you plan after the election to help unify this city? And how do you plan to address some of the negativity in your own campaign? Do you plan to have an open door policy, or will everyone who wants to see you have to make a, let me repeat that. Do you plan to have an open door policy? How will you settle disputes among council, employees, etc.? The citizens expect the mayor to be available 24/7. How will you address that? Well, since that was the majority of my questions, and of course I had several questions specific to our youth who are under the age of 18, how will you focus on building community to care for and nurture our children? What's your vision for our youth to make Columbus more of an attractive place? And what will you do to help our kids want to be successful? Those are the questions I plan to ask Bill Strauss. Unfortunately, he decided he didn't want to be on this podcast, that my podcast is very negative for our community in his mind. And so he decided, rather than answer questions that were asked identically of the other two candidates, he preferred not to appear. So here we go. Here's our duck of the day. Quack, quack. I want to thank you for coming on my podcast, the Tombigbee Tales. Until next time.